Hi guys, welcome to your last virtual lecture of the year. We are finishing up Romeo and Juliet. Hopefully up to this point you guys have enjoyed it a little bit. So let's take it back to Act 3, which you guys finished up last week, but I'm still going to kind of work our way through it so that you guys have an idea of what is to come in Act 4 and Act 5 for the end of the play. So Act 3 begins with Benvolio and Mercutio walking down the street, and the two of them are talking, and Benvolio says that he believes that the heat, the hot sun of the day is going to bring upon a fight. So he has this ominous outlook on the day, and he's rather afraid. And at this point, Tybalt shows up, okay? And he is, in fact, ready for a fight, but the person that he wants to fight is Romeo. Now, at this point, Romeo enters, and he is ecstatic because he just married Juliet earlier that day. Nobody knows about this. The only four people in this entire play that know about this marriage are Romeo, Juliet, Friar Lawrence, and the nurse. Okay, so nobody else knows. And when he shows up, he's very, I'll say, skipper or chipper when he sees Tybalt, because he's now his kinsman or relative by marriage. So he tells Tybalt basically that he loves him and he means him no harm, yet Tybalt challenges him to a fight or to a duel. But Mercutio, being the hothead that he is, ends up stepping in and challenging Tybalt himself because he becomes irritated at Tybalt's constant badgering of Romeo. Now, this fight, one could say, and I think it also depends on the version that you see or the version that you watch, this fight is not necessarily supposed to end in death. It's almost a little bit comical, especially if you watch one of the versions from 1968. But as Mercutio and Tybalt are dueling and fighting with their swords, Romeo steps in and he tries to tell Tybalt, listen, enough with the violence, I love you like a brother. And just as he does this, Tybalt stabs Mercutio. And inevitably this leads to Mercutio's death. But just before he dies, he yells out, a plague on both of your houses, or a curse on both of your houses, because this wouldn't have happened if they were not fighting. So then Mercutio ends up falling to his own death, and Romeo, in a fit of rage, runs after Tybalt. And in their little scuffle, he ends up killing Tybalt himself. But right after he does this, he realizes that what he just did almost sealed his own fate. And he yells out that he is Fortune's fool. He says, oh, I am Fortune's fool, which basically means, oh my goodness, I messed up. And Benvolio tells him to run away because if anybody sees him, he's going to be killed. Now, at the end of the scene, the prince enters with a crowd of people, including the Montagues and the Capulets, and they find out what happened. But rather than sentencing Romeo to death, the prince actually exiles him or banishes him to a place called Mantua. Scene 2 then begins with the nurse rushing in to tell Juliet the news of Tybalt's death. Now, since she is out of breath and she is so upset by this, her words pretty much are twisted in a way that Juliet doesn't really comprehend what she's trying to say. In fact, she actually thinks that Romeo himself is the one that has died. So here she is now upset. The nurse then, the more she talks, Juliet realizes that, oh no, both Romeo and Tybalt are dead. But finally the story is settled, and she finds out that Romeo killed Tybalt, and he is now banished. And Juliet then says that Romeo's banishment is worth 10,000 of Tybalt's death. So, as you can tell, she's very upset by this news. Even more upset by the fact that Romeo is going to be banished from Verona. But at the end of this scene, the nurse then does tell Juliet that she's going to find Romeo. She knows where he's going to be hiding, and he's going to bring her to her that night. So scene 3 begins with Romeo hiding in Friar Lawrence's cell, and the nurse walks in. And after he asks the nurse if there's any news from Juliet, he then tells himself that she's going to think of him as a murderer, and he picks up a knife almost as if to kill himself or to stab himself. But Friar Lawrence stops him and basically calls him a coward or a baby for doing this. So the new plan that they discuss together is that Romeo would enter Juliet's chambers that night so they could spend their wedding night together. Now keep in mind, this is all happening within a day or a couple days of each other. So Romeo starts out getting married in the end of Act 2, kills Tybalt that same day at the beginning of Act 3, and now this following night, Romeo is going to sneak up into Juliet's bedroom. So he's going to sneak up there, and then in the morning he's going to leave very early so that nobody sees him and he can escape to Mantua. Moving on to scene 4, this one, in fact, the rest of this act is pretty short. In scene 4, Capulet basically tells Paris that he is agreeing to give Juliet's hand in marriage to him, but they have to wait until Thursday due to Tybalt's death. They have to wait until Thursday to get married. In the last scene, Romeo and Juliet spend the night together, and the two have this lovely talk in the morning about the birds, the lark and the nightingale, and everything, and they finally realize that it is in fact morning and Romeo has to go. And in heartbreak, Romeo tells Juliet that he will see her again as he descends down the ladder. So it truly is a pretty sad scene, especially when you think about the fact that these two lovers are fated or doomed from the start, since this is a tragedy. But that entire act, Act 3, the climax of the story, is very, very action-packed. Okay, so we start out with the death of Tybalt all the way to the plan to get Romeo and Juliet together, and then Romeo escapes. Okay, so we begin Act 4, and this is where, if we're looking at a kind of a chart on how Shakespearean acts work, or Shakespearean plays work, this is going to be the falling action. So this is where things are really taking kind of a chain reaction and falling into place. Okay, so after scene 3, or Act 3 rather, Juliet decides to go to the friar for help because she finds out that she is now going to be married to Paris at the end of Act 3. So she runs to the friar's cell seeking some advice or seeking some help from Friar Lawrence, and it just so happens that Paris is there talking to the friar as well. Now the friar ends up telling Paris that he needs to hear Juliet's confession, so Paris must go away, and the two of them discuss what they're going to do about this whole Romeo banishment and Paris wedding thing. So as the two talk, we find that Friar Lawrence has this potion, this sleeping potion that is going to simulate death, and Juliet is to take that, and she is going to be presumed dead by her family and everybody else. She's going to be taken to the Capulets' tomb, where they would bury all of the Capulet bodies, this large mausoleum. And Romeo is then going to come in and find her when she wakes up, and the two are going to run away and live happily ever after. It seems like a foolproof plan, except that it does not. So after Juliet runs back to her house, in scene 2 of Act 4, she tells her parents that she's changed her mind about the marriage and that she consents. And this, much to her parents' surprise, is great news for them. So they decide that they're getting ready for the wedding, and we need to even push the wedding up. Now, scene 3, Juliet asks the nurse to leave her as she spends her final night in her bed alone. And at this time, we know she's going to be taking that potion, that sleeping potion. But before she does this, she has some doubts, and she goes on this monologue, or this speech, discussing the fears that she has. One of them being that she's going to wake up and Romeo's not going to be there, which I'm sure you all can understand why that might be scary. All of a sudden you wake up in a tomb of dead bodies and you're all alone. So it is a very valid fear, I would say. But eventually she takes the potion, toasting to Romeo and their future together. Now, the end of Act 4, the family finds Juliet and they believe her to be dead. So rather than getting ready for a wedding, now they have to get ready for a funeral. Okay. So a complete 180, a complete change of events. It is something that you can feel for the family as you read this. Although we know that it's not true, we know that she's not dead, you can still feel for the family, as they would have been preparing for a wedding only to find out that the bride is now dead. So very, very tough stuff. Now, Act 5, this is one where you can really start to see how fate plays in this story. And you can start to... It's actually almost upsetting to a lot of people, because it seems like the deaths of our main characters could be avoided, but they actually are unable to be avoided in the story. So Romeo in Act 5, Scene 1, is in Mantua, right? It is this barren place far off from Verona, where he is exiled. And he's there, and he learns from one of his servants, Balthazar, that Juliet is dead. So Balthazar does not know the truth. Okay, Balthazar is only reporting what he has heard in Verona. Now, Romeo does not know what's going on. He doesn't know the plan. Okay, so he asks Balthazar if there is a letter from Friar Lawrence, because this could be all part of his plan, but in fact there's not. So Romeo then says that he needs a pen and paper to write to his family, and he sprints off to find an apothecary. And if you don't know what an apothecary is, it's basically somebody that deals with chemicals and drugs and plants, and an old school chemist that makes medicines and potions and everything like that. So Romeo finds one so that he can buy a poison. And knowing this story, I think we understand what Romeo is going to be using that poison for. Now, in Scene 2 of Act 5, this is where it gets a little bit upsetting, and it is kind of funny that we are reading this scene, or talking about it, during this time off. And I'll tell you why. In Scene 2, Friar Lawrence is in his cell, and he is talking to another friar, Friar John, and he asks him how Romeo responded to his letter detailing the plan of Juliet's fake death and everything that we learned about previously. Now, right now, you're thinking, wait a second, he did send a letter to Romeo. The only problem was that Friar John was not able to leave the city because they were quarantining the city due to an outbreak of the plague. So unbelievably ironic that we are talking about that aspect of Romeo and Juliet while we are currently under quarantine for coronavirus. So I just find it kind of funny that this matched up and lined up almost perfectly. But it is very upsetting when you think, if only Romeo could have received that letter, he would understand what to do. Instead, he is going off to do something crazy, going off to buy poison so that he could kill himself. All right? Now, Scene 3, this takes us to the end of the story, and this is the iconic moment in Romeo and Juliet. If you know anything about Romeo and Juliet, other than maybe the balcony scene, this is going to be it. Romeo shows up to the tomb, to the Capulets' tomb, And it just so happens that at this exact time, Paris is there too. Now, Paris sees Romeo going in, but he feels like Romeo is there to defile the graves, to defile Tybalt's grave or Juliet's grave, and he is in such a fit of anger and sadness that he gets up and verbally accosts Romeo and basically challenges him to fight. Now, Romeo, in his stupor, tells Paris that he needs to leave because he's not there to fight Paris. He's not there to do anything other than to see Juliet and to drink poison. But the two end up getting into a bloody sword fight where Romeo stabs and kills Paris. But just before he dies, Paris asks Romeo if he can lay his body next to Juliet. Now, Romeo agrees to this and says yes, which is a tribute to his character throughout this, that he is a genuinely good character throughout. But at this point, Romeo goes up to Juliet and he sees her body, and he says that it almost seems impossible that a dead body could look so beautiful, which is ironic because we as an audience know that she's not actually dead, and that's why she looks the way she does. So Romeo gets up next to Juliet and he drinks the poison, killing himself. Now, moments later, and when I say moments, we are talking very, very shortly after this, Juliet wakes up. So if Romeo would have been late by a couple of minutes, this whole thing might have been unavoidable. And Juliet wakes up as the friar enters. Because keep in mind, the friar now feels like he has to take matters into his own hands to try to be there for Juliet, but also stop Romeo from doing something crazy. So as Juliet sees Paris lying down bloody and dead, sees Romeo dead next to her, and the friar, she doesn't know what to do, and the friar is now fearing that the guards are going to come and see everything and that he's going to be blamed for everything. So he leaves Juliet alone. And at this point in time, Juliet grabs a dagger and stabs herself, killing herself next to Romeo. So a very, very tragic scene, a very upsetting scene, especially when you think that this all could have been avoided if Romeo would have gotten a letter, or if Juliet would have woken up a few minutes earlier, or Romeo would have been there later. There are so many factors that go into this, but it is very upsetting nonetheless. Now, after Romeo and Juliet's death, a crowd of people, including the Capulets, the Montagues, and the prince, arrive at the tomb. And they witness the bloody mess that is in the Capulets' tomb. At this point, we find out from Montague that his wife, Romeo's mother, has actually died from grief due to Romeo's banishment. So that's just one more body, one more character that has died in this play. If you think about who all has died, now we have Mercutio, Romeo, Tybalt, Montague, Juliet, Paris. There are many, many deaths that all seemingly could have been avoided if we didn't have this feud between two families, right? So at this point, everybody wants to know what happened, and the friar then confesses and tells of Juliet and Romeo's secret marriage and their love for each other, and this is all confirmed by the letter that Romeo wrote to his parents. So at this point, the families basically look at each other after being scolded by the prince, and they agree to put this feud behind them. And this relates all the way back to the very beginning in the prologue, where it says that only by the death of their sons and daughters can this feud be resolved. And now we've come full circle, where the death of Romeo and Juliet has finally put everything aside. And in fact, Romeo and Juliet's statues are going to be constructed in the city by both families. Now, the play finally ends with a very, very famous line spoken by the prince. This is one that you will probably hear more than one time in your life. You might hear this twisted to fit another story or spoofed in a TV show. But the quote is, "For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo." So a very tragic ending, a very sad ending, but actually a beautiful ending as well when you think about the love that these two had for one another. But that right there takes us to the very end of Romeo and Juliet. I'm hoping, for those of you that are watching this video, I'm hoping that you enjoyed the play. I'm hoping that you took the time to read as much of it as you possibly could. I want to commend everybody on their efforts for bearing with us throughout this entire experience. But on that note, keep up the good work. Everything is due by the end of May, so please don't rush to get this done. And hopefully we'll see you guys soon.